She was 23 years old, and the wagon simply did not stop when she woke that morning at the edge of the trading camp. The man who abandoned her was her own intended husband, Elias Corbett, a fur trader she had traveled west with under promise of marriage, who had grown increasingly cold through the final weeks of their journey and who, she would later understand, had simply decided somewhere along that cold northern trail that a wife was more burden than benefit to a man hoping to travel light and fast through unclaimed country. What she had left, when she finished searching the abandoned camp for anything he might have overlooked, was $7, a sewing kit, and a growing understanding that the small trading settlement of Cormorant Falls, where their wagon train had briefly stopped 2 days before, was the only place within walking distance that offered any hope of shelter before winter closed the passes entirely. She spent those $7 standing before an indifferent town agent in Cormorant Falls, on the settlement's old, crumbling fur trading post, shuttered for nearly a decade since the regional fur trade collapsed and the post's original proprietor vanished without settling his considerable debts to the trappers who had once supplied him. They said the post's back storage shelves had been built unusually deep against the rear wall, deep enough that something had always seemed to lie concealed behind them, though no one in Cormorant Falls had ever taken the trouble to find out what. What she found behind those shelves would not just answer that decade-old curiosity. It would return to the trapping families of Cormorant Falls something they had spent 10 years believing was lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hartley. If you have ever watched someone you trusted simply leave without looking back, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Josephine Hartley had been born Josephine Ames in the river town of Millport, situated where a modest tributary met the larger waterway that carried much of the region's commercial traffic. The second daughter of a ledger clerk named Bartholomew Ames, who worked for over 2 decades at the town's largest trading company, a man whose reputation for scrupulous, exacting accuracy in his record-keeping earned him considerable respect throughout Millport's modest commercial community. Bartholomew brought Josephine into his small home study from an early age, teaching her the discipline of careful bookkeeping alongside her elder sister, though it was Josephine who showed the deeper aptitude and genuine interest, absorbing not merely the mechanical process of balancing accounts, but her father's underlying philosophy that a well-kept ledger told the complete truth of any enterprise, that discrepancies, however small, deserved careful investigation rather than convenient dismissal, and that the seemingly dry work of tracking goods and payments actually represented, at its heart, a form of honest stewardship over other people's trust. Josephine's mother, Agnes, died when Josephine was 13, and in the years that followed, her father leaned increasingly on both his daughters to manage the household while he continued his demanding work at the trading company, a responsibility Josephine embraced with the same careful attention she brought to her bookkeeping lessons, learning in these years not only numbers but the practical management of provisions, inventory, and household resources that would later prove unexpectedly relevant to circumstances she could not have imagined as a girl balancing her father's household accounts. It was through her father's work that Josephine first gained real exposure to the fur trade, Millport's trading company serving as a regional hub through which pelts collected from trappers throughout the northern territories passed on their way to eastern markets, and she developed, in her late teenage years helping her father review the company's fur trading accounts, a genuine fascination with the trade's particular rhythms and vocabulary, learning to distinguish grades of pelt quality, to understand the seasonal patterns that governed when trappers brought their goods to market, and to recognize, through careful study of her father's records, the honest patterns that distinguish a well-run trading post from one where the proprietor's accounts told a less trustworthy story. She met Elias Corbett at 21, when he came through Millport buying furs on behalf of a trading concern operating further west, a confident and outwardly charming man who courted her with an attentiveness that flattered a young woman whose quiet competence had rarely been celebrated for its own sake by anyone outside her own family, and when Elias proposed marriage after a courtship of several months, proposing that she travel west with him to help establish a new trading operation in the territories, Josephine's father expressed private reservations about a man he found difficult to fully read. Reservations Josephine, in the flush of a courtship that felt like her first genuine adventure, chose not to weigh as heavily as perhaps she should have. It is worth understanding, before the rest of this story unfolds, that Josephine's careful, inherited fluency in honest bookkeeping and a genuine practical knowledge of the fur trade, absorbed at her father's side through years of patient instruction, would prove to be the exact combination of skills that later unlocked the truth Cormorant Falls had spent a decade unable to fully explain. Though in the hopeful early weeks of a journey where she had no reason to suspect any of it would ever matter again, The fall came with a swiftness that left Josephine, in its immediate aftermath, struggling simply to comprehend what had actually happened to her. Elias had grown increasingly distant through the final weeks of their overland journey, a coldness Josephine attributed at the time to the genuine hardships of frontier travel rather than any deeper change in his intentions, and it was only in retrospect, piecing together small details she had not fully registered as significant, that she understood he had likely begun reconsidering their engagement well before he finally acted on that reconsideration. The wagon train they traveled with made a brief stop at the small trading settlement of Cormorant Falls, nestled in a river valley that had once supported a modest but genuine fur trading economy before regional trapping yield declined sharply following over-harvesting throughout the previous decade. And it was there, on a cold morning after the wagon train's other travelers had already broken camp to continue west, that Josephine woke to find Elias's own wagon, and belongings simply gone. No note left behind, no explanation offered beyond his absence itself, which he eventually understood, through a brief conversation with another traveler who had overheard Elias's plans the previous evening, represented a deliberate decision to continue west alone rather than proceed with a marriage and a partner he had apparently decided, sometime in those final difficult weeks of travel, he no longer wanted. Josephine spent that first terrible day in a state of genuine shock, searching the abandoned campsite for anything Elias might have left behind that could sustain her, finding only $7 in coin that had fallen from a torn pocket in her own travel bag, a small sewing kit she had packed herself, and the devastating clarity that she was now alone, essentially penniless, in an unfamiliar territory with winter approaching and no realistic means of returning to Millport before the passes closed for the season. She made her way into Cormorant Falls itself that same afternoon, the small settlement offering the only immediate shelter and community within any reasonable walking distance, and spent her first days there in a state of careful, controlled desperation, taking stock of her genuinely limited options while trying to project a composure she did not entirely feel to the town's modest population of trappers, traders, and their families, most of whom regarded the sudden appearance of an abandoned, young woman with a mixture of sympathy and the particular wariness small settlements often extend to unexplained newcomers. It was during these difficult first days, inquiring at the town's small administrative office about any available work or lodging, that Josephine learned the settlement's old fur trading post, shuttered for nearly 10 years since its original proprietor's abrupt and financially catastrophic disappearance, was technically available for purchase from the county at a nominal price. The structure having sat in legal limbo for years while the county pursued unsuccessful efforts to identify any legitimate claimant to the property beyond the debts it still nominally carried. The trading post history, as Josephine pieced it together through cautious inquiries around Cormorant Falls in the days following her arrival, carried its own considerable weight of local grievance and unresolved bitterness. The post had been operated for over a decade by a man named Augustus Prine, who had built, in the settlement's more prosperous early years, a genuinely successful trading operation serving trappers throughout the surrounding territory, purchasing their pelts at agreed prices and arranging their transport to eastern markets in exchange for a standard commission, an arrangement that had sustained both Prine's own modest prosperity and the broader trapping economy of Cormorant Falls for the better part of a decade. But regional fur yields had begun declining sharply in Prine's final years operating the post, a decline attributed at the time to simple overharvesting of the surrounding territory's fur-bearing populations, and as the trade grew leaner, Prine had, according to the accounts Josephine gathered from several of the town's older trapping families, begun falling increasingly behind on payments owed to trappers who continued bringing him their goods on the understanding that payment, while sometimes delayed, would eventually be honored as it always had been in the post's more prosperous years. This arrangement had finally collapsed entirely one autumn nearly 10 years before Josephine's arrival, when Prine simply vanished from Cormorant Falls without settling the considerable debts he had accumulated to perhaps a dozen local trapping families, taking with him, so far as the town understood, whatever remaining value the post for inventory and cash reserves might have represented, and leaving behind a shuttered building and a bitterness among Cormorant Falls' trapping community that had never fully faded even as the town itself had gradually adjusted to operating without a proper trading post of its own, most families now making considerably longer journey to a competing post in a neighboring settlement to sell what fares a diminished regional trade still yielded. It was against this backdrop of local grievance that Josephine offered her $7 for the abandoned post, a purchase the county agent accepted with visible relief at finally clearing the troublesome property from official limbo, and Josephine found herself, Transaction complete. The owner of a structure that carried. She quickly understood from the guarded reactions of several townsfolk who learned of a purchase. Considerably more emotional weight in Cormorant Falls than its crumbling physical condition alone might suggest. She entered the building for the first time that same afternoon, finding it largely as a decade of neglect had left it. Dust thick across every surface, the front counter where Prine had once weighed and priced incoming pelts still standing though warped with age, and, along the rear wall, a substantial run of storage shelving built unusually deep enough that Josephine, running her practiced eye across the structure with the same assessing attention her father had taught her to bring to any set of accounts or physical inventory, immediately recognized as disproportionate to any legitimate storage need the shelves might have originally served. Josephine spent her first week of ownership simply establishing herself within the building's more habitable front rooms, patching what gaps she could in the walls against the approaching winter cold, and subsisting on the modest income she began generating through mending and simple bookkeeping work for several of Cormorant Falls merchants, work that let her demonstrate, in small practical ways, the genuine competence that gradually began softening some of the town's initial wariness toward. But her mind returned repeatedly, in the quiet evenings after her day's work was done, to those unusually deep rear shelves, and she began, with the same patient methodical attention her father had modeled throughout her childhood, a careful physical examination of the shelving's construction, measuring the actual depth of each shelf against the visible space they occupied along the wall and discovering, through this careful measurement, a discrepancy of nearly 2 feet between the shelvings. Apparent depth and the true depth of the wall space it was built against, a discrepancy that suggested, unmistakably to her trained and careful eye, a concealed space behind the shelving unit itself. This discovery, considered alongside what she had already learned of Augustus Prine's abrupt and financially catastrophic disappearance, began to trouble Josephine's careful mind in a manner that felt increasingly urgent rather than merely curious, and she spent several additional days making cautious inquiries around Cormorant Falls regarding Prine himself, learning from the town's older residents that he had been, by most accounts, a genuinely careful and detail-oriented proprietor throughout the post-prosperous years, a characterization that struck Josephine as somewhat inconsistent with a picture of a man who had allegedly simply abandoned his obligations and vanished once the trade grew difficult, prompting her to wonder whether the town's settled understanding of Prine's disappearance might not represent the complete truth of what had actually happened. Working with tools she found still stored in the post's small workshop area, Josephine spent several evenings carefully working the aged, warped shelving unit loose from the wall it had stood against for over a decade, a task complicated by the wood's brittleness with age, but ultimately achievable through the same patient, careful technique her father had always emphasized over hasty force in any delicate task. And when the shelving finally came free from the wall on a cold evening with her lantern held close against the building's deepening shadows, what stood revealed behind it was not, as she had half expected, simply an empty concealed space, but a narrow room, clearly built deliberately into the structure's original construction rather than representing any later addition, containing a modest but genuine cache of preserved furs still hanging from their original drying racks, several sealed strong boxes, and, most significantly for what it would ultimately reveal, a substantial collection of ledgers and personal papers that had evidently sat undisturbed in that concealed space for the full decade since Prine's disappearance. It took Josephine the better part of several nights, working carefully through Prine's preserved ledgers and personal correspondence by lamplight, to piece together a picture that fundamentally rewrote everything Cormorant Falls believed it understood about his disappearance a decade before. The ledgers themselves, maintained with the same careful precision Josephine's own father had always modeled in his own bookkeeping, told a story considerably more complicated than simple financial collapse and abandonment. Prine's record showed that in his final active years operating the post, he had indeed fallen behind on payments to local trappers, but his private correspondence, preserved alongside the ledgers, revealed the reason behind that shortfall had nothing to do with the declining regional fur trade the town had always assumed was the cause. Prine's letters, addressed to a business partner in the eastern markets whose responses were also preserved among the papers, described a scheme this partner, a man named Thaddeus Wren, had proposed and gradually drawn Prine into, rather than the regional fur trade genuinely declining through over-harvesting as Cormorant Falls had always believed. Wren had been systematically underreporting the actual market prices Prine's furs commanded once they reached eastern buyers, pocketing the difference. between the true sale price and what he reported back to Prine, who in turn had less capital available to pay the trappers supplying him than the genuine market value of their furs should have provided. Prine's later letters grew increasingly anxious as he apparently began independently investigating actual Eastern fur prices through other contacts, discovering the true extent of Wren's deception and realizing that he himself, however unwittingly, had been complicit in shortchanging the very trappers whose trust had sustained his business for years. An unwitting complicity that nonetheless left him personally liable for debts he had genuinely believed, based on Wren's false reporting, he simply could not afford to pay. His final surviving letter, dated just weeks before his disappearance from Cormorant Falls, described his intention to travel east personally to confront Wren directly and, if successful, to return with the actual funds owed to recover his debts to the trapping families who had trusted him, a letter that explained, with a clarity that struck Josephine forcefully, why he had concealed his remaining fur inventory and modest cash reserves behind the false shelving before departing, protecting these assets against the possibility that his journey east might fail or take longer than anticipated, fully intending, based on every indication in his careful correspondence, to return to Cormorant Falls and properly settle his obligations once he had recovered what Wren owed him. There the correspondence ended, with no further letters and no record anywhere in Prine's preserved papers of what became of him after his departure east, and Josephine understood, sitting alone with this evidence in the cold stillness of the concealed room, that Augustus Prine had very likely never abandoned Cormorant Falls by choice at all, but had instead either failed in his confrontation with Wren, met some misfortune on his journey, or perhaps simply never found his way back for reasons his own decade-old silence could no longer explain. A possibility that reframed the town's entire settled understanding of a man they had spent 10 years remembering as a debtor who simply ran rather than as someone who may have died attempting to make things right. Were that Josephine Hartley had discovered something significant concealed behind the old trading post shelving spread through Cormorant Falls within days, and the town's reaction, once the general nature of the discovery became known, carried a complexity Josephine had not fully anticipated, the preserved furs and cash reserves representing a genuine, tangible sum that could meaningfully address at least a portion of the decade-old debts Prine had left unpaid, but the deeper revelation, contained in his correspondence, that the town's entire settled narrative about his character and disappearance might be fundamentally wrong, proving considerably more difficult for some long-time residents to readily accept. Among those most resistant to this reframing was a prosperous local merchant named Silas Kettering, who had, in the decade since Prine's disappearance, built the town's competing general store into Cormorant Falls' dominant commercial establishment, a rise in prosperity that Josephine gradually came to understand had been built, in meaningful part, on absorbing much of the trading business the old fur post had once handled, and who, she began to suspect, had a personal interest in the town. Continuing to view Prine as simply a dishonest man who fled his debts rather than reconsidering the more complicated truth Josephine's discovery suggested, Kettering called on Josephine directly within the week, presenting himself with a polished civic concern for the town's well-being, arguing that stirring up old grievances and uncertain decade-old mysteries served no one's genuine interest, and offering, with apparent generosity, to simply purchase the recovered furs and cash outright from Josephine at a fair price, allowing her to quietly settle whatever debt she felt personally obligated to address while sparing the town further disruption, over a matter he characterized as better left in the past. Josephine, drawing on the same careful, measured composure her father had modeled throughout years of exacting bookkeeping work, thanked Kettering for his concern, but told him she felt a genuine obligation to first properly understand and document what Prine's papers actually revealed before making any decisions regarding the recovered assets, a response that seemed to visibly unsettle Kettering despite his continued outward courtesy. In the days that followed, Josephine encountered a subtle but unmistakable pattern of resistance to her continued investigation. Several townsfolk who had initially seemed willing to discuss her memories of Prine grew notably more reticent. A local carpenter who had agreed to help repair storm damage to the post's roof discovered he was unexpectedly too occupied with other work, and Josephine began to understand that Kettering's evident stake in Cormorant Falls' settled narrative about Prine's disappearance represented a real, if quiet, obstacle to properly honoring what she now believed was owed both to Prine's memory and to the trapping families who deserved to finally understand what had actually happened to the debts they had carried resentment over for a full decade. Rather than allow this quiet resistance to discourage her, Josephine made a decision that had been forming steadily in her mind since her first full understanding of Prine's correspondence. She would bring both the recovered assets and the complete documentary evidence directly to the affected trapping families themselves, trusting that the combination of tangible restitution and genuine documentary truth would prove far more meaningful and harder to dismiss than any private arrangement. Kettering might prefer. She spent the following 2 weeks carefully cataloging Prine's ledgers against her own careful research into which specific families had been owed payment at the time of his disappearance, work that drew directly on the exacting bookkeeping discipline her father had instilled in her years before, and she reached out individually to each of the 11 families whose names appeared in Prine's final accounts. Families like the Okonkwo's and the Delacroix who had continued trapping throughout the surrounding territory across the intervening decade despite the diminished trade, several of whom, Josephine discovered in these individual conversations, had passed down to their children a settled resentment toward Prine's memory that had shaped, in small but real ways, how those families understood their own place in Cormorant Falls history. Among these was an elderly trapper named Benedict Okonkwo, who had lost nearly a full season's earnings to Prine's disappearance a decade before and who had never fully recovered financially from that setback, and who wept upon reading Prine's actual correspondence documenting his genuine intention to make things right. The particular grief of a man forced to reconsider a decade of resentment he now understood had likely been misdirected against a man who may well have died attempting to correct the very wrong he was owed for. Josephine organized a public gathering at Cormorant Falls Small Community Hall, inviting not only the 11 directly affected families but the broader town, and presented, with the same patient thoroughness her father had modeled throughout her childhood, the complete story contained in Prine's preserved papers, reading from his correspondence with Wren and distributing, to each affected family, their proportional share of the recovered fur inventory and cash reserves, calculated with exacting precision against what Prine's own ledgers showed each family was actually owed. Kettering, present at the gathering as he was present at nearly every significant town occasion, attempted initially to characterize the recovered documentation as unreliable and impossible to properly verify after a full decade, but his objections carried increasingly little weight as family after family examined Prine's careful, dated correspondence alongside his exacting ledgers and recognized, in the specificity and internal consistency of his records, the unmistakable marks of genuine documentation rather than any convenient fabrication. And by the gathering's end, the town's settled understanding of Augustus Prine had shifted decisively from a man who abandoned his debts to a man who very likely died trying to correct them. The restoration that followed unfolded not through any dramatic legal proceeding but through the quieter, more meaningful process of Cormorant Falls collectively revising a decade-old injustice it had never fully examined, the 11 affected families receiving genuine, if modest, restitution from the recovered assets. Sums that for families like the Okonkwo's represented a meaningful, if not transformative, correction to debts they had carried for 10 years. Silas Kettering faced no formal consequence for his quiet resistance to Josephine's investigation, having committed no clear wrong beyond a self-interested preference of convenient silence, but he found his standing in Cormorant Falls subtly altered nonetheless, the town renewed a more complicated understanding of its own trading history, prompting several residents to look with fresh, less deferential scrutiny at exactly how thoroughly his own prosperity had been built on the vacuum Prine's disappearance had left behind. Josephine herself, once the recovered assets had been properly distributed and Prine's story properly documented and shared, made a decision to reopen the trading post itself, drawing on both a genuine fascination with the fur trade cultivated in her father's Millport office and her hard-won practical experience navigating Cormorant Falls' commercial community, establishing an operation built explicitly on the transparent, exacting bookkeeping standards her father had always modeled, publicly posting the actual prices her furs commanded in eastern markets so that no trapper supplying her post would ever face the kind of hidden deception that had once, however unwittingly, compromised Prine's own operation. The post reopening brought renewed commercial life to Cormorant Falls' trapping community. Families no longer required to make the longer journey to the neighboring settlements post, and Josephine found herself, within that first year, building genuine standing in the very town where she had arrived with nothing beyond $7 and the sting of Elias Corbett's abandonment. It is worth remembering, in the end, that Josephine Hartley began this story left behind adorned by a man who simply decided she was not worth the trouble of a proper goodbye, arriving in Cormorant Falls with almost nothing beyond her father's careful lessons in honest accounting. She did not buy that crumbling trading post expecting treasure. She bought it because it was the only shelter available to a woman with $7 and nowhere else to turn, and because something in her father's old lessons about careful, honest attention to detail had never left her. What she found behind those false shelves was not merely recovered furs and cash, though these provided genuine restitution, but something Cormoran Falls needed considerably more. The true story of a man the town had wrongly remembered for a decade, and the patient, careful work of finally setting that memory right. Thank you for spending this time with Josephine's story, and with all of us who gather here to remember what patient, careful attention can restore. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever been left behind by someone who simply decided to stop looking back. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something others had already written off as worthless or forgotten? We read every story you share with us, and we are always moved by how many of you carry your own quiet Josephines within your history. Until next time, stay close.